Hello and welcome back to my channel What If Deku 2.0. Join us as we delve into the realms of fanfiction and fantasy, bringing you the best stories and discussions. Today, we're kicking off part 1 of our series, What If Hacker Deku Joined League of Villains? If you enjoy this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more content in the future. The author of this story is AuthorRei from Archive of Our Own. All the relevant links are in the description. Feel free to say hello to the author on their profile. Now, let's dive into the fanfic. In his short, some 16 years life, Izuku Midoriya had done many idiotic things. For starters, he had made the mistake of befriending Kachan when he was 5. It was something Izuku couldn't really blame himself for, given that he had been, well, 5, but even before Bakugo had gotten his quirk. He had always been the one to act the hero. And when it came down to kids, when there was one hero, there was always a contrasting villain. Izuku had also wanted to become a hero, even when he was discovered to be quirkless and deemed useless by society at large. Even All Might, after saving him from a villain, told him as much. And despite the bitter rejection, he had drowned himself in his own studies to hopefully make it one day, if as nothing more than a sidekick. He had latched onto his computer as a form of coping, learning, teaching, something he'd had access to since he was a young boy. One day, he made the mistake of hacking into the police database. It was completely innocent, he told himself, as he wanted information for his hero notebooks, and to update the one he had on known villains as well. It was strictly for curiosity, even if it was definitely illegal, and he was specifically looking for the information that the police tried to cover up. He hadn't been as careful as he was now, nor did he have his current skill. Not only was he locked out, but their security was upgraded, and heroes were tasked with attempting to track him down. Not that they succeeded. He certainly wasn't careful enough, but his skills were more than enough to get the heroes off his tail. Even then, he had been constantly looking over his shoulder for weeks, looking for any sign of a hero tailing him, jumping at every sound and running like a frightened rabbit the moment he spotted one in the vicinity. He supposed that was when his descent into villainy started. Even after everything that happened with his best friend, he still didn't want to cross that line. Izuku danced across it from time to time, but he tried to convince himself that it didn't mean he was a full-blown villain. At worst, he would call himself a vigilante, if only to make himself feel better. It was only when his mother got dangerously sick that he had to do something. He had gone online under the name Deku, just as a quick cover, to post hero information for sale to the highest bidder. It had gone pretty quickly, and he was able to look after his mother, deposit money in the accounts to pay the bills and keep food stocked in the fridge, though he soon found himself selling more and more, at increasing prices as his skill increased, hacking into more well-protected and secretive databases. That was what had first put him on the villain's radar. He wasn't entirely bad. From the footage that he found, he sold information about villains as well, to who he hoped were heroes when he couldn't be bothered checking who they were behind the anonymous profile. But no matter how much anyone pushed for information, he had 3 simple rules for his online doings. 1. Do not meet up in person to exchange information or money. 2. Leave no trace online. 3. Do not directly contact anyone, hero or otherwise. He did his best to abide by those rules, even though he bent them a bit whenever he saw an attack on some camera and hacked into nearby hero comms to give orders. Even though it was rare, he would always give a little smile as he watched heroes barely visible in the corners of cameras jump at the robotic-sounding voice that had just entered their ear. Those that refused to listen paid the price later when they realized that he had been right. And after every transmission, he left his calling card. Rumors had begun circulating about the mysterious Deku by the time he was 13 among heroes and villains alike, even if civilians had yet to catch on. The heroes were careful not to scare them. They were smart. Faith in hero society had been crumbling, bit by tiny bit as more and more villains popped up and the heroes were proven more incompetent, no matter All Might's presence. And Izuku relished it all. Well, perhaps relish was a strong word. He didn't agree with how hero society was structured, but it was a system that needed to be in place. Despite his hatred for All Might for taking away his one dream, his one life's purpose, he couldn't deny the work that the heroes actually had done for this society. The heroes had managed to message him individually on several occasions, each time under a different username, and every time, he had never responded. They really weren't subtle. He could practically feel the eagerness behind those messages, the desire to pin down a location and finally get Deku arrested. However, when a message came in from an unknown user, Deku felt compelled to reply, instead of tracing who they were first. It was just a simple chat, nothing more. 1. I am here to contact you with a job offer. Deku tapped his keyboard, contemplating the word choice. It was different than the usual questions about information or the demands. He doubted it could have been All Might, or even another hero, but the wording seemed too strange to him. I am here. It was All Might's signature, so much so that it dipped into his more normal conversations he'd caught over hero comms. What a joke. All Might wasn't there where it really mattered. Even so, he didn't feel as if this was from one of the heroes, and he generally had a pretty good feeling when it came to assuming character just by their messaging patterns. Before he could even think about it too much, he sent a message back. It was short, revealed nothing, and yet it still felt like he'd locked a guillotine blade over his throat. Deku, I'm listening. The reply came in almost instantly. 1. My associate will meet with you in person to discuss. This is something I would rather not put online, if you understand my meaning. Izuku bit his lip as he contemplated a response, his fingers lightly resting on the keys, typing and retyping a message. He understood very well why they were cautious, which was very smart, especially online. No virtual trace, no chance for heroes to find evidence of misdeeds. Even he wasn't good enough to completely remove his own digital footprint. Not yet, anyway. However, when he attempted to find out more about this unknown user, to look into him like he'd been less inclined to do when he saw the initial message, all that came up was a blank wall. No leads, no traces, no profiles, no data. They were clearly more skilled than he was, and he wasn't willing to take that chance. All it took was a little bit of digging, and they'd figure out exactly where he was. Deku, that will not be possible. I apologize. 1. What a shame. I was looking forward to seeing you work in person, Midoriya. His blood ran cold. They were more skilled than he. Deku, I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. His hands shakily typed out the message. Had he not been careful enough? Did he leave a trail? Or was it a hero who suspected him in person? If it was a hero, he'd get arrested. If it was a villain, that might even be worse. They were a greater risk, because that might mean his death rather than just a few years in prison. 1. I have an offer for you. Your abilities in exchange for a quirk. Deku, now I know you're lying. Izuku didn't mean to be snarky, not when they clearly had all the power. He almost instinctively apologized, but he bit back his words and leaned back in his swivel chair, casting a look around his dark bedroom as if something could protect him from whoever was on the other side of the screen. This wasn't one of those nightmares where he could just bury himself in blankets to hide from the monsters lurking under his bed or in his closet. These monsters were real, and he felt like if he took it, he'd be making a deal with the devil. His eyes fell on the All Might hoodie that his mother had gotten him as a gift only a year before, still hanging unused on one of his bedposts. A pang of guilt went through his chest, but he turned his eyes back to the screen, shutting out the remnants of the child he used to be. That child was long gone. It was a shame he still tried to hold on to memories of a better time. 1. On the contrary. As I said before, I would prefer to speak in person. Are you interested? 1. There can be an arrangement to pay you as well for any work done outside of what is asked of you. The user sent another message containing a number, and Izuku didn't even hesitate before slamming his fingers on the keys to come up with a response. The offer seemed too good to refuse. With his mother still in recovery, he needed that money. Deku, name the time, name the place, I'll be there. Izuku met up with the mysterious one's associate in a park only a few miles from his home a few days later, trying to throw together something to shield his identity. He had thrown on the hoodie that his mom had gotten for him and donned a black medical mask. He would have gotten more, but he didn't have much beyond a headset, and the only good that would do is if he linked it to his phone to alert him of nearby heroes, and that program didn't even work half of the time. Dealing with villains was extremely dangerous, but now he didn't have much of a choice. He would have alerted heroes, but then he would have had to explain why he had been threatened in the first place, which would likely lead to getting arrested. Even if they would take pity on him as a child and pretty much the sole provider for his family, they wouldn't take kindly to him willingly selling their secrets to villains. Intentional or not, he was as bad as a villain in their eyes, and they would definitely bring him in, even though he would alert them of bigger, badder villains that had to be lingering in the area. That left him only one choice. He was alone, had no backup plan, and could very well be killed. It wasn't like his life had any meaning anyway. Izuku was, after all, quirkless. He arrived in the park early by a few minutes, carefully watching his surroundings for any people. No one was around. It was possible that one of them had a quirk that kept them hidden, so he didn't want to take any chances. One of his notebooks was hidden against his body, a reassurance that he might have what they wanted so that they could leave him alone. However, one had mentioned a job offer, and he had to say that he was intrigued, at the very least. It wasn't every day that a kid got offered a quirk, even though that person had to have been lying. Even in a world where literally anything could be a quirk, it just wasn't possible. Right as the clock struck 9, a black and purple fog appeared out of thin air, growing and warping like a giant pile of sentient sludge. Izuku took a step back in alarm, but watched, transfixed as two glowing yellow eyes appeared in the middle of the fog, and immediately focused on him, standing alone. Deku, I presume? It took him a moment to process, before he hesitantly nodded, carefully observing the fog before him. That's me. You're young. He tilted his head to the side. Was the name from earlier a bluff? No, it couldn't have been. If one knew his name, then he had to know his age. I'm surprised one didn't tell you. He did? I didn't expect you to be a child. I'm 14, Izuku didn't mean to snap, but he didn't like it when people discredited him as just a kid. I haven't been a child in a long time. Now are we going to talk, or am I just wasting my time? The void seemed to ponder this for a mere moment. My master wanted to speak with you directly. One, as you call him. I am simply here to transport you there. Teleportation quirk, Izuku said immediately, mind pondering the implications, apprehension not quite gone, but at least dulled. Quirk analysis had always been one of his favorite topics. You create portals to specific locations, don't you? Yellow eyes scanned him thoroughly, thoughtfully taking in his appearance and his words. They didn't have pupils or any definition, like the rest of the body, but Izuku could feel the hair stand up on the back of his neck from the sudden feeling of being stared at. Your work does not give you enough credit. If I hadn't known, I would have assumed you had an analyst quirk. That put a sour taste in Izuku's mouth. Let's just get this over with. Before he could say anything else, the fog began to spread and warp around him, obscuring his vision from anything other than purple and black smoke that passed over his body as if a ghost was walking through him. Hold still. Izuku tilted his head up, waiting patiently for the haze to clear from his vision. He shivered, despite the coziness of his jacket. To keep calm, he bunched the material up under his fingers. It kept him grounded and out of his mind, out of whatever panic was bound to come. He needed to be fully prepared for whatever was on the other side. There was a pretty high possibility that he would die today. Deku knew this, but he wasn't afraid. If they were going to kill him, he wanted it over with. That would be his price to pay for meddling with villains. His only regret would be not saying his goodbyes to his mother. He would have regretted not informing his friends, if he had any. At this point, the only thing he would lose would be the one thing he was trying to protect. As of right now, she'd be fine. He was okay with that. Midoriya. He spun around, quickly scanning through the fog for who was speaking to him. Wasn't it supposed to be cleared by now? He'd been transported somewhere else, if someone else was now here. The voice chuckled. I'm afraid I will be keeping the barrier up for a little while longer, at least until we come to an agreement. Are you one? Izuku blurted out, as the voice that was speaking to him sounded nothing like that of the portal villain. It had to be. I am called All for One. I was the one who contacted you. Oh. Deku crossed his arms, attempting to look unfazed, knowing that it didn't work in the slightest. You claimed that you offered a quirk as payment. I did, was the reply. You can stop with the lies. What do you want me to do? There are many others that want my work just like you do. The man laughed again. Oh, Midoriya, we really are impatient, aren't we? If you're going to kill me, then do it. Izuku didn't know where the extra confidence was coming from, but he appreciated it all the same. If not, stop wasting my time. Well then. The fog was pulled away from his vision, revealing the portal villain standing at the side of what had to be All for One, hooked up to so many machines and monitors that Izuku couldn't tell if the man was dead or alive. The room was very dark. The glow of yellow eyes, the only thing that let Izuku see where he was supposed to be looking. My quirk allows me to give and take quirks, the newly dubbed All for One said. I have spent a long time tracking one down for you. Forgive me that it took so long. Deku tilted his head. I'll believe it when I see it. I will give you the quirk when you agree to my terms. And if I don't? Then I will have Kurogiri take you home. I am not one who kills without reason, Izuku. Deku considered this for a moment and nodded. All right, what are your terms? Deku did not leave that building without gaining much. But he lost much as well. Kurogiri took him home, as All for One promised. Deku was beginning to believe that he was truly a man of his word. But it was only long enough for him to gather his notebooks and anything else he might need. Kurogiri took him to someplace different once he stepped back into the portal, now known as a warp gate, to an abandoned bar with a basement where their operations were planned out. That was where Deku set up his camp, creating new accounts on the many computers that All for One had provided for him. His new quirk was barely brimming under the surface of his skin, a faint tingling that he had yet to get used to, but he ignored it easily enough. Those that lived in the base left him alone as he got things functioning and running smoothly. Kurogiri had helpfully mentioned that there would be others who dropped by from time to time, some even with new recruits like him. All for One had given him another name. It was to keep his family safe, as he had said. It was to be used from now on to keep him safe and undercover. Izumura Shigaraki appreciated the gesture, but Deku didn't care one way or the other. As long as they left him alone, he would work for them. They did give him a quirk, after all. But despite the villains clearly keeping their distance, it didn't take too long before something interrupted his silent musings. Hey, kid. A blue-haired teenager leaned on the open door of what Deku claimed as his room. Heard you were the new player. The teen stood in the doorway, his red eyes carefully watching Deku. Deku watched him right back, eyes scanning him up and down. He didn't know the other's quirk quite yet, and being in a lair full of villains, it was probably best to play it safe for now. Hello, he tried. Name's Deku. There was a beat of silence before the other person responded. Tomura Shigaraki. His eyes scanned the room before turning back to Deku. I heard my master sent you to help us. As I understand it, he shifted in his seat slightly. I'm to give you information on the heroes when you need it. Anything else is outside of the contract and I'll be paid separately. Tomura scowled. Damn you and your contracts. You're here to help us take down All Might. I hope that won't be an issue given your, he fixed his eyes on the hoodie, interest in him. Despite the mask still covering his nose and mouth, he fought to keep his face carefully blank, forcing his always expressive eyes to be devoid of emotion. I have no issues giving you information on him. A job is a job, Shigaraki. I hold my end of the bargain. Crossing his arms, he got up, attempting to look, at the very least, not scared. I've got far too much experience to be bound to any one group. I'm here as a thank you to all for one. Make no mistake, if I get a better offer from someone else for anything outside of what I was asked to do, I will sell to them instead. I know all about your little group. You need me. Now leave and let me do my job. He didn't turn his back to Tamura. How could he, when the clearly annoyed teenage brat could potentially have a quirk that could kill him without a second thought? Instead, he kept his eyes locked with the villains, praying to whatever god that would listen that he would go away and just leave him alone. Somehow, miraculously, Shigaraki turned to leave. I expect great things, Deku. And if not, his red eyes turned to lock with Deku's. I tend to kill things that disappoint me. Deku didn't respond, only tilting his head up higher, keeping eye contact until the villain left. He let out an unsteady breath and quietly crept up towards the door, closing it with a soft click. He would have locked it, but most of his instincts told him that maybe they wouldn't like that all that much. This was his life now. He might as well deal with it. Shigaraki's quirk was ... interesting, to say the least. While he hadn't heard much from All for One, nor had Kurogiri said anything, he knew that it was powerful and extremely destructive. If he had to guess, he would say it was something that broke down objects directly, if the effect it had on his body was anything to go by. The scabbed-over skin and the cracked lips surely had to be from his own quirk. As a villain, it wasn't likely that others would attack him directly, especially if he was the unofficial head of the group. The League of Villains, as All for One so helpfully called them. Deku shook his head. A name like that couldn't be any more tacky. His new quirk had not proven much of an issue, but then again, he had not used it to get into the devices provided. A small incident pulled him into the world of the internet by accident, something that minorly freaked him out. It was like a baby learning to walk for the first time. He stumbled, he fell, and he got spooked, and retreated to his original state, quirkless and utterly useless. Unfortunately, he did not have much time to learn, not with villains constantly breathing down his neck for results. He had to master it, and quickly, before they broke the contract and killed him for not providing. Well, if they did, at least his mom would have enough to live off for the rest of her life. He cast a glance at the 13 notebooks stacked on the back corner of his new desk. Every single one held information that he had painstakingly collected, pouring blood, sweat, and especially tears into every letter, every fight that he skipped school to go watch, the times when the battle got far too close for comfort and he ended up wrapping his injuries in a locked bedroom so he wouldn't worry his mother. They were worth more than their weight in gold, and he was lucky enough not to have lost any of them. And who knows? Maybe with this new power he could add on to them and sell the information as needed. The money was not really needed on his end, so he could take just enough to survive on and split the rest among his mother and the many quirkless kids he had met in his old school, all relentlessly bullied for having no power. It wouldn't help them, he knew, but it could be a comfort in a world where there was none. Deku shook away his thoughts. They weren't needed right now. The skills he had learned throughout his dealings would be far more valuable to him than some useless remembering of a middle school lifestyle. He had no time to spend reminiscing about the past. There was a quirk he had to master. The computer sat innocently in front of him, but it was far from that. Pausing, with his hands gently resting on the keyboard, he took a deep breath, attempting to access the new power within him. It was just burning under the surface, ready to be used. With his only thought hoping that it didn't go badly, he willingly closed his eyes and dove into the complicated mind of a machine. He opened his eyes mere seconds later at the utter silence that echoed around him. Neither a whisper nor a word, not even the creaking of a door or any other activity that would signify life. Endless lines of green text rolled through a black void, each one a line of increasingly more and more complex code. He couldn't even tell what each one of them led to, just knew that they must have been a way out of the void. One of the lines drifted in his direction. Without even thinking about it, he reached out to grab at it. The text dissolved into pixels, and the scrolling lines seemed to shrink in size, moving far, far away from where he was. A tiny, blinking rectangle appeared just in front of him, about the size of a phone. It took him a moment to realize that it was a cursor, waiting for input. There was no keyboard, though, so he did the next best thing. Location? The word location appeared and disappeared in a fraction of a second, before a holographic globe materialized before his eyes, a small dot in the middle of Japan. Somehow, without even enlarging the map, he knew just where he was. The words came to him in his mind, input from a computer that followed his every wish. And he knew just the way to properly test it. Japanese police case files, he called out. Maybe this was where he would properly get to see all that was promised for this quirk. Sure, visualization was useful, but he didn't really need it to do his job. Having an AI in his mind that translated his every desire was useful, and something that most would kill for, but not for Deku. Unless the quirk gave him something that he would otherwise be unable to do himself, it wasn't worth it. Instead of facing a system that he would have to breach, Deku was greeted by the sight of a large bank vault, a giant handle at the front, just waiting to be opened. Unlike everything else in this cyberspace, it seemed solid, not even the slightest bit transparent. Questions floated across his mind. Was this supposed to be a metaphor for the firewalls surrounding their systems? Slowly, he made his way over to the object, every step against the floor emitting small traces of glowing electricity making its way through the pathways embedded in the floor. His hand met the solid, cool metal of the safe. The moment it did, a combination flashed through his mind in a messy array of ones and zeros. Somehow, though, it made complete sense to him. His hands twisted the handle, and it opened, swinging open on silent hinges. The inside appeared much larger than the safe made it seem. Rows of shelves labeled in glowing blue text, alphabetized going down the row, divided into ongoing, cold, and solved cases. As he walked past, any labeled file that his eyes settled on for more than a second appeared in a digital envelope, slowly moving up and down, waiting for him to grab until he turned away. So this was the digital world that his quirk offered. He had no need to code a single line of text anymore. His mind did it for him. What a power this was, and it made him wonder who All for One obtained it from. Surely with a quirk like this, they could have been rich, if they used it correctly. They certainly would have no issues finding a place to sell their talents to, just like Deku was doing now. Whoever it was from, he would put it to good use. He withdrew from cyberspace, only to find the exact documents he had been looking at open on his computer, numbered case files blinking at him, waiting to be opened. So this quirk wasn't just in his mind's eye. Good to know. He glanced at the time, minorly shocked when he discovered that he only had been using his newfound quirk for a few minutes, rather than the half an hour it felt like as he was figuring logistics out. It warped his perception of time as well. That was also another interesting point. He would note it down in his books, but he was not about to give his own weaknesses to anyone who cared to take a look at his writings. He could keep his own notes in his head. His clients didn't call him analyst for no reason. There seemed to be nothing else to do in the small room, nor did he particularly want to dive back into the computer world, but on the other side of the wooden door lay untold numbers of villains with unknown quirks, and he most certainly did not want to push his luck on the first day. It was late enough, and he had many things to be doing tomorrow, so he concluded that it was time to turn in. It might have been early for any other self-respecting teenager, but Deku was far from ordinary. In an ideal world, he might have been a hero. He might have been in this world, perhaps. Well, not anymore. Quirk or no, He wanted nothing to do with the majority of the so-called heroes that patrolled the streets. He might help them on occasion, for a hefty price, but that was the extent of it. No person in the world could convince him to give up the life he had. It was by no means comfortable, always having him on his toes and checking over his shoulder. But that was what he had chosen, and that was the life he would live. Desperate times called for a change in mindset. It was far too late to change his mind anyway. Just before he fell asleep, he pulled out his phone. If this hacker quirk truly lived up to his expectations, he would be able to access anything. That included the stuff he had yet to get into, the most secure files on top heroes across the world. If he could get into those, the world would be at his beck and call. He didn't necessarily want to rule the world, but these villains clearly did. Maybe he could find a way to do his own thing, with none of them finding out. As long as he remained in contact with them, he was sure they wouldn't care what he got up to. On his phone, he had a secure file that he had managed to download before he got booted from their servers. He had no clue what it contained, but if it was so secure that he couldn't even get into it, there had to be something extremely valuable behind the digital lock. And he didn't care what was in the file, if it was even valuable to him. He wanted to break into it. It didn't take long before he entered cyberspace again, the file hovering in front of him with a large, unbreakable lock keeping it from him. So this was how his mind visualized it. "Unlock," he called out. It didn't budge. His brow furrowed, and he tried again. "Unlock?" Nothing. The lock didn't even budge an inch, nothing to show that the attempt had made any progress at all. "Okay," he said aloud. "Okay. What's different about this lock?" Sometimes he found that talking himself through the equation helped him figure things out. Asking the questions out loud often helped him figure out the mistakes he made when he was younger, so it was bound to help him now in a new environment, teaching himself something that had not been done before. What was the simple solution? A key. He clapped his hands together. The other lock needed a combination, not a key. He paused, glancing at the lock. Key. I need a key. How do I get a key in here? It was clear now that his quirk only benefited him if he knew how to solve the problem in the first place, consciously or not. "I need a key," he repeated, more trying to get some form of reaction from his surroundings, the green text around him annoyingly unhelpful. "Am I supposed to code one myself, or is this going to work for me?" Letters seemingly pulled themselves out of their lines of code, floating in his vague direction, meeting with others and forming into a solid object. It wasn't a key, much to his disappointment, but when he grabbed it, he noticed that it was moldable, like clay. "So this thing gives me the base work for everything. Okay? I can work with that." It took an embarrassing amount of reforming, but when he finally pressed the barely passable key into the lock, it clicked open to reveal the information inside. Just like in the futuristic tech movies, the internal documents scattered around him in a circle, waiting for him to open each one. It didn't surprise him how much was there. It had been well protected after all, but it still was a lot to go through, and certainly not something he wanted to do at that time. Deku pulled himself out of cyberspace and dropped the phone to his chest. He had been in there far longer this time, as it was nearly 11. Staying up later didn't really bother him, though. At least he got in. He shut his eyes, rolled over on the bed, and was asleep within minutes, the computers in the corner of the room slowly blinking off. Almost a year had passed with the League, and yet it didn't feel like it had been that long since Kirigiri pulled him away from that park. They had gotten some new members, most notably a few dozen thugs and low-level thieves to keep the police off their tails. Tamura spoke of all for one's planned invasion of UA, though it was still several months away. Every day, their brokers seemed to be pulling in new members to watch their backs while the fighting was going on. And unfortunately, it was Deku's job to keep watch over all of them. He did his best, however begrudgingly, and used the cameras located all over the city to keep watch over them. They lost several to petty crimes, their quirks not strong enough to stand up to the heroes. Some didn't even have that, and got taken in by regular, good as quirkless police officers. God, Deku detested police officers, yet he really had no reason to. It was the insinuation from All Might that they were where the reject heroes ended up. Somehow, he found himself keeping his distance. Though heroes were the real issue, he couldn't stop himself from hating the cops along with them. Just the mere hint from All Might was enough to keep him far away from the supposed law-abiding protectors. Izumura shook his head. How pathetic was he, still listening to the words of a hero who left him alone on a rooftop, able to jump at any point without a second thought. Sure, another hero might have come along to stop him, but did All Might really even consider the words coming out of his own mouth? The least he could have done was make sure he was all right and get him down to the ground safely, to avoid an incident. Maybe then the disappearance of a quirkless kid wouldn't weigh so heavily on his conscience. Well, Deku wasn't sure if it affected him. But he was certain All Might had seen at least one of the news articles. He had made sure to send it to his computer. Or phone, he couldn't really remember. All he knew was that All Might definitely knew. After a year, with no other leads, they would be forced to conclude that he was dead. Surely then, All Might would recognize his mistake, and Deku could work more openly now that Izuku Midoriya was dead. UA entrance exams were coming up, and Deku would be lying if he said that he hadn't considered at least attempting the exam. The test itself would not be that complicated, and he was fairly certain that he could arrange for it to be taken elsewhere, rather than on site. Ketchon would surely be at the testing as well, and it would do no good for his cover to be blown this soon. Plus, as a student in UA, he would be infinitely more valuable to the League, not that he wasn't already. His skills could easily get him into the computer systems, but that was far too boring. Actually snooping around was part of the thrill, all the nervous energy buzzing in his bones while he wondered if this was where they would catch him. Online? No, he was far too good. There was no fun in it. He needed the thrill, the slight danger that he might be found out. Lingering in the base, left behind while the others went out, was no longer fun to him. He had to do something. The day before applications had to be in, Izumura Shigaraki was typing up his essay and submitting it along with the filled-out form to the UA website. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to take his written test off-site, so he only had the hope that he would not be placed near anyone he knew. It was wildly unlikely that he would be, yet there was always the chance. Luckily enough, the combat test would be simple for him. If all they had to do was take down robots, if he could find a quiet place to delve into their computers, he could shut all of them down in a single fell swoop. Proving it was his doing would be much more complicated. If he truly wanted to get into UA, if only to see how they functioned and trained heroes, he had to show off his quirk. Unfortunately, it was extremely likely that the teachers there, all pro heroes, would recognize his work as similar to the vigilante villain. He wasn't sure what category he fell under that often left small hints of his presence wherever he went. His appearances had never been in person, he had made sure of that, but even if he did want to show up with heroes around, he had to have a disguise. And definitely not anything like the shitty mask and hoodie he had worn to meet Kurogiri. That would not do at all. The exams were still several months away, after all, and he had the time to plan and work out what he was going to do. From his own findings, it appeared that All Might was considering accepting a job at UA. Working right under the nose of the #1 hero was far too appealing for him to deny. It was just yet another on the list of reasons why attending UA would be beneficial for him, hero or no. He had a lot of information on All Might, yet very few of it was useful to him or anyone. That was probably the one issue All for One had with him. There was nothing he could do to counter All Might. For all intents and purposes, All Might had no weaknesses. Well, All for One said he knew of one, but that was another issue altogether. Izumura pushed himself away from his desk, stretching his arms above his head. Sure, his job involved remaining at a computer and keeping watch over everything, but it didn't exactly do much to keep him active. Over the last several months, his already pale skin had gone practically ghost white, He needed some sort of sunlight, even if being out of the base was a danger to his entire mission. Questions swirled in his mind as he stood up and made his way towards the door. Would he be spotted? Would he be followed? Would he be arrested? He knew, of course, that he was overreacting. Deku only had a digital calling card. No face could warn the heroes of his existence. As it was, he was near his home city, as he had come to realize. The urge to see his mom was far too great. He could see her just once in passing, right? That wouldn't do much, would it? Passing through the bar, he wasn't surprised to see Tamura sitting on one of the stools, a drink non-alcoholic. Kurogiri would kill himself before he let a child drink resting in a gloved hand. The gloves had not originally been his idea, but Deku had adjusted them a bit so Tamura could game on his phone in peace. The favor was appreciated in the form of Tamura not yelling at him as much. "Where are you going?" he grumbled into his drink. "Out," Deku replied coolly. They weren't friends to any degree, barely business partners as it was. He had no business knowing where he was going. Red eyes turned to watch him as he grabbed his jacket from the coat rack next to the bar. "Thought you were supposed to stay inside and do other shit." Change of plan. He pulled his jacket on, throwing the hood over his head. "Have to do some intel gathering. We'll be back late." "And you can't do that online?" Of course. Here he was, woefully ignorant of the dealings that couldn't be done online. "Trust me, if I could be doing it online, I would be." Deku reached for the door handle, the back of his neck prickling uncomfortably as eyes bored into him. "I have other clients that I need to get in touch with. I'll be back later." Before Tamura could utter another word, he slammed the door behind him, tightly gripping the handle so he couldn't be followed. When nobody tried to twist it, he let go and breathed out a sigh of relief. He had a mask in his jacket pocket, and he slid the straps over his ears, covering his nose and mouth. It wouldn't do much in the long run, with his hair being, well, green and easily spotted and remembered. While unnatural hair was common in their society, it was not a risk he wanted to take, especially since photos of him had been posted in nearby cities searching for him only weeks previously. Everything might be fresh in people's minds, but he had enough confidence that he would not be spotted. It had been far too long since he had seen his mother, anyway. He was due for a trip. Taking the train was not a difficult matter. He dealt in cash, preferring to leave no virtual trace. Erasing it later would be no issue, yet under close inspection, it could be questioned. It was far too much of a hassle to deal with, so going without a noticeable trace was a much better solution. Plus, it was common enough that nobody really looked twice. Even so, there were security cameras stationed all around the platform. He swore he could feel the eyes of the security guard behind them watching him, like he was doing something wrong. There was no reason to be anxious, but still, he hadn't been out in a long time. Especially after dealing with villains for years, he became more and more wary of anything that could potentially reveal him. Heroes were also nearby, going to take the train to other cities. It was normal, he knew this, but it didn't settle his nerves anymore. He couldn't be recognized as Deku, but there was always the chance that one of them would see him as the boy he used to be and turn him into police. If Deku went inactive soon after, surely the police would piece things together. They might be incompetent, but they were not stupid. He made that mistake once before, and that had nearly ended with multiple heroes being dispatched to his detected location, as he had been working in a small cafe known for housing vigilantes. Deku managed to route them elsewhere, sent to different places to stop various crimes, and only then could he breathe easy. He changed locations after that, hiding his devices in a backpack and using his old-school uniform to keep hidden in plain sight. When the train arrived, he got swept up in the small crowd to get on, despite the train not being all that crowded. Eventually, he settled in a small seat in the back corner, earbuds in his ears and phone in his hand. His bangs shielded his eyes, concealing where he was looking, and to the untrained observer he would look like nothing more than a teenager hunched over the phone in his hand. Really, he wanted to keep an eye on the heroes that he now shared an enclosed space with. Part of him really wanted to mess with the heroes, just to see their in-person reactions. However, he knew that if they caught him snickering about a message sent in their comms, they would arrest him before he even had a chance to run and switch to another train. Not only that, but he doubted he would be able to get somewhere safe before they told their own agents to monitor the cameras in the area. His quirk had no defensive capabilities, as far as he was aware. In fact, it left his body vulnerable, so much so that he had to post a camera to monitor himself and those around him while he was in cyberspace as to react quickly. Aside from that, he found no other way to keep himself safe, which meant that in a life or death situation, it would be more of a hindrance than a help. Deku connected his headphones to his phone, quickly glancing at the heroes to make sure they were not paying attention. Most seemed uninterested, buried in phones or staring vaguely out the window. If he used his quirk now, it was probable that they wouldn't notice. It was dangerous, especially with them around, but for now it should be all right. He was just a kid, after all. Illegal quirk usage was prosecuted more for adults. It didn't take long for him to get back into the heroes' systems, listening to the dispatchers relaying news of crimes, incidents, and villain sightings, calling certain heroes to each scene. It was busy, people always talking, something always happening. But it was relaxing to him. When he pulled himself out of cyberspace, he listened to the calming words of the dispatchers as they called out certain heroes in cities nearby him. He could have fallen asleep if it wasn't for who stepped on the train at the next stop. Yagi Toshinori, the man more commonly known as All Might. This time, he wasn't in what Deku had come to realize as his powered-up form. Instead, he was lean, skinny, and practically a skeleton. No hero costume, no obnoxious yellow suit. Nobody would recognize him like this, and Deku counted on it. He felt a surge of something, he didn't really know what it was. But he had a sudden desire to mess with the number one hero. Deku watched All Might find a seat closer to the back, close to him yet not close enough to be anything concerning. The hero's phone was in his hand, taking up what looked like barely any of his attention and, almost unnoticeable, an earpiece rested in his ear. It was a simple matter to wait for him to properly pay attention to his phone, and it was slightly more complicated to get into his phone from here. However, as long as they had the device connected online, Deku could reach it. Finding out how to screw with him was a little harder. He had so many options. Instead of anything too complex, he whited out the static running through the earpiece. He could see the slightly confused look as All Might reached up, almost fiddling with the device, before glancing at the heroes around him, and deciding to leave it be, his hand coming back and folding in his lap. "Are you going to take the job?" Deku typed out on his phone, sending the feed directly to the earpiece. It would only come through as a slightly robotic, mechanical voice, and indeed, All Might jumped at the voice coming through his ear. He glanced around worriedly, picking up his phone to most likely text someone involved with his tech. "You try to alert anyone, and I'll wipe your phone." All Might jumped again, his eyes scanning the train. Deku made himself scarce, hiding his eyes behind his hair and typing out another message to hopefully not look suspicious. He could feel his heart rate elevating, and he wondered vaguely if All Might could hear it. Text this number. It wasn't his phone number, but rather a rerouted one that linked to his phone. He would sever the connection after their conversation was over, and then there would be no trace of him ever having it. Not having much of a choice, All Might complied, typing furiously, "What do you mean, take the job?" Deku grinned. "The teaching position, of course. What other position would I mean, All Might?" He could practically see the gears whirring in the hero's mind, trying to find a solution to the situation. "I'm afraid you have the wrong number." "Don't be silly. I know All Might when I see him." It was a risky move on Deku's part, but it worked. Instead of concluding that whoever was on the opposite end of the screen was on the train, All Might grit his teeth and typed out a response. He glanced up once he'd finished, and Deku's phone alerted him a moment later. I am assuming this is the hacker I've heard so much about. Oh, you've heard of me. Deku could have clapped his hands together in delight. As it was, he settled for replying to the hero with a smile, content in the knowledge that he now had his phone number. I'm pleased. I haven't done anything directly against you, so I wasn't positive you had. The name's Deku. Deku. Why are you doing this? Why not? It's fun. It's illegal, and you know that. Do I? All Might just looked more and more frustrated, gripping his phone tighter and tighter. If he was in his muscled form, he would have cracked it in two. Izuku was more than pleased to see the #1 hero so powerless in such a situation. You sell hero information to villains. That is not something I stand for. In case you weren't aware, I sell to heroes as well. Anyone who has the money, I'll work for. Like you, All Might, I very rarely do things that will not be of a benefit to me. Then why speak to me? Deku tapped his phone warily. What should he say here? I bring a warning. When he didn't elaborate, All Might tried to prompt him. About? You're smart. I'll give you a hint. See if you can decode it. All JPS POF ZIL IOEF VA. Before All Might could respond, he severed the link, booted All Might from the conversation, and reset his phone just in case. The earpiece's signal was unblocked, and Deku let the stream of data return to All Might's ear. He listened in for a moment and then turned on some calming music to help settle himself. Deku's heart was pounding, and this time it wasn't just from excitement, but a touch of fear as well. It was far too on the spot for his liking. He had come up with the cipher far too quickly. Any person looking in the right place would be able to decipher it, and that meant that he betrayed his contract without any sort of benefit to him. If Tamura found out, he would be dead. Literally. He got off the train at the next stop, along with All Might and a few other heroes. He didn't have the courage, nor the energy to mess with any of them after the stunt he just pulled. Why had he done that? Heroes were the problem with this society. Why did he help them? Oh, he was so screwed if the League discovered anything was up. Applying to UA would just be the nail in the coffin if they discovered it. He would be forced to flee to the heroes, and that wouldn't be a pleasant conversation. It only then properly occurred to him that he might be in a bad situation, worrying about his life over a hint that he barely gave to a hero who wouldn't have the brainpower to decipher what he meant. And even if it was deciphered, it wouldn't give them much of an edge. Even with a warning, they couldn't possibly be prepared for what was going to happen. Deep breaths, he reminded himself. You are not going to die. Kid, you all right? He jumped a foot in the air, startled by the person who just appeared next to him. It took him a few seconds to regain his composure, but by then he was certain that he had gone bright red under his mask. Yeah, I'm fine, he said slowly, sliding his phone into his pocket. Just thinking is all. The person seemed unconvinced, yet as they looked on further, something akin to recognition flashed in their eyes. He leaned forward, and Izuku pulled away. My name is Detective Nayamasa Tsukachi, he introduced cautiously. Are you familiar with an Izuku Midoriya? Without meaning to, Deku took a step back. Really, I have to get going. It'll just take a moment, I promise. Deku continued backing away. I don't know who that is. My name is Izumura. I'm sorry I could not be of more help to you. At the first sight of a clear pathway, he took off, squeezing through crowds that the older, taller detective couldn't. Even after he was certain that he lost him, Deku still took several random turns to lose himself in the sea of people doing their shopping. They knew he was still alive. He wasn't safe out in the open anymore, not that he was to begin with. Despite police pronouncing him dead, he should have known that exposing himself like this wasn't worth it. There would be those that remembered his face, remembered how similar he looked to his mother, who they likely had spoken with directly. A voice in the back of his mind told him to go see his mom, despite the risks associated with getting caught. He decided to ignore it. It would do him no good to stay out after this, at least not in this city or anywhere nearby it. Deku had no intention of returning to the base immediately, where he would suffer from the wrath of an irritated Tamira for the next several hours, so he decided to find a nice place to hunker down in, to calm his mind and to work. There were still many other info grabs he still had to do for the clients who reached out to him from other countries. Most seemed to be from the United States, seeking information on their top heroes. Without being in person to observe the fights, it wouldn't be as easy to observe and note their habits. Videos would work, but not for underground or not well-known heroes. If there was no information in their files, he would be at a loss. However, when he settled in a small cafe in the sketchier part of town, buying a coffee to settle his nerves, he found several more emails in his inbox, waiting. In fact, one of them was sent mere minutes before he arrived at the cafe. From a certain detective Naomasa Tsukachi. His own curiosity prevented himself from deleting the email immediately, so he clicked on it to read. Given the circumstances, it was strangely polite. Good evening. I was told I could reach Deku this way. As I understand it, you recently came into contact with All Might in order to give him a warning. I would like to discuss this more with you, if you are able. While I do not expect you to make an appearance in person, a few recent events have caused us to question your classification as a villain. Ah, so they did consider him a villain. Well, if that was how they were going to play it, then he would play along as well. He continued reading. According to several heroes, you have hacked into our communication devices on multiple occasions. Our own searches have detected breaches recently, each one with your clear signature. Though many times you did nothing, you have rerouted heroes to crime scenes where they were needed, as well as give direct instructions to heroes to report crimes that had only just begun happening. Looking over camera footage, it appears that your messages reached heroes just moments after a disturbance took place, long before any heroes or police would catch it. I have also heard that you have, on occasion, sold or given information about current and cold cases to heroes. I will admit, many of those in my office have described your work as a blessing and a weight off their shoulders. My opinion has not been made yet. You are still a danger, and I would rather work with you in the future than against. I would prefer not to have someone in a bad situation, and selling to villains is dangerous. It can get you killed if you continue. I await your response. Deku hummed, glancing up at the people walking around the cafe. It wasn't all that busy, yet he still had to be careful that nobody was looking over his shoulder. Even a civilian could betray him, even if most tended to stay silent. The email was nicely worded, but the detective was asking for assistance on other cases. Deku loved a good mystery, yet the most he usually was able to do was analyze their quirk and their habits. While effective in solving, it wasn't all that interesting most of the time, unless the case had something he was personally interested in. It might help the heroes, but it wouldn't solve it entirely, and that annoyed him greatly. He decided to type an email in response, as it had only been a few minutes and the detective was likely to see. Thank you for your interest, but I do not do things without reason. I am aware of what I have gotten myself into, and I am well aware of the dangers it has. That being said, I work for pay, as any other person does. It just so happens that villains pay better for my talents than heroes ever did. I will admit, I have some level of interest in working with you. If you are not already aware, my specialization lies in quirk data and analysis. I can monitor and track events and people, though usually I monitor a specific location for several hours before switching to another high-crime area. I cannot catch everything, nor do I believe I will be much use to you in tracking villains down unless I get their location first. While I do not disclose clients' information, I can warn you that several have quirks that allow them to avoid capture. I cannot help you very much. Deku would have written more, but when the cafe door opened again, the bell ringing to announce a new customer's entry, he jumped, accidentally hitting send. It wasn't a total loss. After all, he hadn't revealed anything bad, nor had he said anything suspicious. His location could not be tracked, he was sure of it. But his attention was drawn to the hero that just walked in. Shouta Aizawa. an underground hero, more commonly known as Eraserhead. Unknown, for the most part, and homeroom teacher of the first years in UA. He should have known that more vigilante-esque heroes like him would frequent sketchy cafes like this one. Of course, there was no reason for him to suspect anything, as a teenager alone in a cafe with a laptop was far more likely to be a kid catching up on schoolwork than a brainstorming villain. With or without a quirk, Deku had the ability to type, so even if Eraser's quirk was activated, it would have no bearing on his work ability. He continued to type away, watching as the hero settled into a seat and ordered a cup of coffee. Doing nothing but watch would help his notes, yet that would make him suspicious. Deku took a sip of his coffee, pulling up his notepad and adding a small note to file under Eraserhead later. Did not have to ask where to sit nor asked for a menu, possibly frequents Canon Cafe. It would not be wise to hack into any major systems with a hero just by him, so he brought up another document and added several things to look over later. Revealing a quirk in front of him would also not have been a good idea. Look over stuff for All Might, he muttered under his breath. Potential quirk malfunctions in smaller stature. He paused for a moment. Lost access to quirk? Potentially. He didn't even notice himself speaking, a small thing that had been kept with him since elementary school, but it was always quiet enough that nobody knew what he had been saying. Apparently, heroes had better ears than he anticipated, and Eraserhead looked up, glancing at him carefully writing a list of potentials. Deku noticed after a few more minutes, cautious red eyes trained on him and his laptop. He took a long sip from his drink and set a few bills down to pay for it. Waiting around would definitely not be fun if he was suspected of anything. Eraserhead was one to trail those he found suspicious quietly, marking their habits before attacking. In a way, he was just like Deku. He needed a way out, and quickly. Sure enough, not long after he left the cafe, he heard footsteps behind him. His headphones were on, yet no music playing, so the hero would be confident that his already quiet steps wouldn't be heard. Deku couldn't go back to the base, not with Eraser following him, but he could go back to his mother's home. He still had a key, one that he kept on him always, and his mother wouldn't be home at this time of evening. From tracking her schedule, he knew that she would be over at Kachon's house for the next hour and a bit, maybe longer if Aunt Mitsuki had alcohol. On Fridays, she always headed over for dinner and to participate in their family nights. Friday used to be their special night, but he couldn't find it in him to be jealous. It was he who made the choice to leave the safety and security of his home. And anyway, if Eraser tracked him there, he could have a chance to reach Kirigiri to pull him back to the base, and even if the house was broken into, there would be no trace of him ever being there. He spent less than half an hour navigating the streets back home, very aware of the hero trailing a few dozen feet behind him. Every so often, he'd find himself pretending to jam out to a good beat, skipping for a moment and bopping his head. He felt stupid doing so, but the people around him didn't seem to find anything wrong with his motions, so he figured it was all right. The key went right into the door, to which he was glad. He was worried that the locks had been changed on him, and that would certainly be embarrassing and even more suspicious for Eraserhead. He shut the door softly behind him and, careful not to disturb anything, made his way to his room, away from the front door. "Mom," he called out, just to throw off suspicion if the hero was still outside. "I'm home. I have so much to tell you." His room door was shut, just as it had been when he left, and the inside was untouched, yet completely free of any dust. Clearly, his mom had been in here recently, dusting off his bed and shelves. If he disturbed anything, it wouldn't be noticed. His phone was lifted up, and Kirigiri quickly dialed. "Hey, Kirigiri? Long story short, I'm in my old room. I need you to come get me." There was a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "I'll be right there, Izumura." The months passed in a daze. After several more close calls, Izumura started avoiding leaving the base as much as possible. Tamura did not press him to get out, nor did he seem averse to having him in the base 24/7. It made it easier to keep an eye on him if he stayed in his room all day. He was almost to the point where leaving his room was considered strange on its own, let alone leaving the base itself. Leaving, for more than just an hour, and asking Kurogiri to warp him to the city where the top hero school was. That was far too suspicious, but it wasn't as if he had any other choice. The terms in his contract never said that he had to disclose his activities with them, either. If Tamura questioned it, he could always lie and explain that he was confirming some suspicions about the soon-to-be pros. That wasn't entirely false, right? Either way, he had to get going soon, or he would miss his time slot. Before he went, he had an appointment with someone who could temporarily change his appearance. Their quirk was promptly nicknamed Cinderella, apparently a widely sought-after ability. It took quite a lot of his own savings to bribe them enough to keep quiet about him and to be available when he needed them to be, but he hopefully had them as an ally, for now. Izumura decided to avoid speaking to Kurogiri about it, and took the train instead a few cities over, where Yue was located, as well as the quirk user he needed to speak with. Hacker was useful, but not always in situations like these where others would be much more preferred. Once he was back on the train, armed with a new face to keep himself hidden, he was on his way to the school. His phone beeped in his pocket, probably Tamura trying to contact him, but he ignored it, switching his phone off. If it really was urgent, All for One would be contacting him directly, and that was never pleasant. Having another person in his head was incredibly invasive, but at least he didn't know enough about whatever quirk he was using to properly mess with his mind. If Deku was right about it, and he usually was, that quirk could be used to shine a light into the dark corners of his mind, the stuff that he didn't reveal to the League under any circumstances. If he found that, there was no place Izumura could run. Well, it wasn't as if he could run anyway, not from someone like that. Yue was relatively far away, so he settled in for the ride, pulling out headphones and connecting himself to the surface of the internet. Diving through the civilians' phones around him was only fun for so long. Not many people actually led interesting lives, contrary to their own belief. The heroes, too, were only so fun after a while. The news appeared to be focusing on the recent hero killer that had suddenly popped up in Japan. Izumura had been following his work, and rather enjoyed watching what he had been up to. Now there was someone interesting, someone he could follow and keep up with. Even he had a hard time predicting the man's next move. With the constant movement around Japan, it was difficult to accurately foretell where and when he would strike next. The one time he had managed to pinpoint his next target, he had been ecstatic when headlines hit the paper the next day about that hero admitted to the hospital from a targeted attack. Was it wrong that Izumura took pride in watching others be hurt? Was it morally incorrect for him to make a game out of going through his list of heroes and attempting to find who would be next on the chopping block? Maybe, but he didn't care. The hero killer wasn't just any normal villain. He was cunning, intelligent, and hard to track. He meticulously planned out his targets, carefully tracked their movements, and made sure no one was around when he finally struck. Sometimes their bodies wouldn't be discovered for hours, and by then he was long gone, and the hero dead. On the rare occasions he had been spotted, he had not engaged with those that appeared and disappeared into the distance far before the police could ever arrive on the scene. His technique was practically flawless. The details Izumura could draw from the case files so minimal that after several months of attacks it would make the detectives cry. But Deku was no normal detective. What nobody else could solve, he could. Painstakingly, he had plotted every appearance and even suspected appearances and mapped out heroes that he would be likely to target. Even then, with few photos and a singular video taken of the hero killer, he had not been able to pinpoint much about him. The little he had managed to gather, such as the name of the hero killer himself, Stain, wasn't much use in looking for his next move. He had no phone, nothing physical that Deku could track unless he planted it himself, which was exceedingly dangerous and risky. This hero killer might be a villain, but that didn't mean that he would play nicely with others like him. No matter what work Izumura did, it would all be for naught in Stain's eyes. The only way to save society was to purge the false heroes. Well, maybe taking them down from the inside would be a little more fun. The train slowed to a stop, and he got off, making his way to the open front gates of the hero school that had been his dream for years. It was a little hard to believe that here he was, about to test for exams with hundreds of potential candidates for heroes. The majority of them would not be admitted and forced to attend subpar hero schools without as much fame or recognition. There were 60 open spots for the upcoming new year in the hero course. Less than 60 would be admitted from the practical and paper exams, while others would be accepted by recommendation, granting automatic entry into the school. He had no clue who would be on that list, which made him uneasy. They would not be selected for another week, in which scores would be analyzed, students would be accepted, and letters would be sent out. He could access that information when they started considering, but for now he was walking blind. He didn't like going in blind. The candidates were all shuffled into a room, given number cards with their testing location, and seated. Izumura glanced around nervously, hoping that his disguise was working. He spotted Kachon, vaguely arguing with a blue-haired boy in a suit. He vaguely looked like Ingenium, though in a world of quirks, anything was possible. He hadn't looked into the Ida family much, though now he was internally berating himself for not doing so. Ingenium had 65 sidekicks, for hero's sake. Why hadn't Deku looked into him more? Present Mike, another hero, walked in to explain the rules of the practical exam, but Deku was hardly listening. He kept his gaze locked on Kachon, carefully gauging his reaction. He didn't seem particularly surprised at what the exam entailed, but then again, nothing seemed to faze him when they were in grade school together. The 0-point monster intrigued him, though. It didn't seem like something the hero course would throw in on a whim. Villain fights in real life were always worth things, whether that be in the popularity rankings, hero rankings, or even just another tally on the long list of defeated crooks. Every achievement was worth something. That would be the bot he would target. Izumura was well aware that he could shut down every robot in the exam area in a matter of seconds. The issue was proving to the heroes that he was the one doing it. He did not want to inadvertently connect Deku and Izumura, so his planning had to be meticulous and precise. One wrong move could put the heroes on his trail. And if the two were linked, he supposed it didn't matter much anyway. He had his ways of remaining undetected, and Deku had no direct criminal implications beyond what they could assume was his work. The only thing they had on him was that he hacked into hero systems to deliver information to heroes, and that he offered to sell villains information to them. It was enough to arrest him, yes, but not enough to hold him. They needed him. They wouldn't just throw him in a jail cell to rot. His line of work was already dangerous enough. He didn't particularly care if they figured him out. Kachon ended up being in his group, as well as the Ida kid from earlier. He got a chance to pull up a few files on his phone, as well as glance at a couple newspapers, confirming the kid as Ingenium's brother. Very similar quirks too, if the engines coming out of his legs were anything to go by. Those would be very useful in this exam. The gates swung open, releasing them into the arena. Instead of running to search for robots, Izumura made a beeline for the nearest building, pushing his way through the door and moving to hide away from the windows. He spotted a camera in the corner and grinned under his mask. This would be easy. He settled down against the wall, crossing his legs, sliding his phone in his hoodie pocket, trying to make a big show out of his quirk without revealing that he could do anything in the blink of an eye. At his stage of quirk development, he could process and analyze information nearly as fast as a computer could. It took far longer sometimes if he was looking through a lot of information at once, but he had lots of practice under his belt now. Linking to his phone, he simultaneously connected himself to the cameras in the room where the heroes were watching, and scanned through the monitors. They were watching him. "He's gone limp," Ectoplasm said. Could it be a medical emergency? Eraserhead, the very hero who nearly managed to track him back to the villains, responded. No, that has to be something with his quirk. Deku suppressed a giggle, sick with glee, as he made several of the monitors go dark. Eraser eyed them cautiously, but continued to watch Izumura carefully, his eyes narrowing. He wasn't concerned. After all, his face was completely different from the one the hero ran into at the cafe. Sorry about this, his voice came through the speakers, warped and distinctly robotic. But when's that zero-pointer going to appear? I want to make sure I shut it down with the rest of them before they're all deactivated. To their credit, the heroes hid their surprise well. Is this you, Izumura? Eraser asked, leaning forwards in his chair. Who else could it be? Deku responded playfully. I mean, with all the other flashy quirks out there, it makes something like mine not seem very special in comparison. His body moved, and he pulled himself back into his own mind, getting up and stretching. They would obviously be paying attention to him now. It's been a good couple of minutes, he announced, still unused to the way his voice warped into someone else's due to the quirk currently in effect. I might disqualify a couple people, but I mean, I can save them from the villains. I don't think I'll stick around long enough for your zero-pointer. He inclined his head, briefly running through the code leading him to the bots. Pretty flimsy security for those ones. With one tiny tug in the back of his mind, he pulled the plug. Almost immediately, the sounds of the battle outside died off, replaced instead by confused chatter between the contestants. Deku had no idea how many robots he shut down, but it was well over half of them, and he wasn't eager to count them and figure out his score. He had gotten his necessary score, and that was all that he cared about. Whatever other points that the zero-pointer offered would just be added onto his first-place score. He gave a mock bow towards the camera and made his way back outside, where he was greeted with the slumped-over forms of dozens of the so-called battlebots that they trained on. Kids walked around, mildly confused at the sudden deactivation, some even kicking at the metal shell. Deku could have fried their circuits, but merely shutting them off also proved his point. It was also less expensive for them to replace as well. All the bots have been deactivated, Present Mike called over the speakers. Please make your way back to the entry point for the written exam. Was this it? One of the others complained. We fight for 2 minutes and they shut the damn things off. No, Deku said quietly. That was me. The kid seemed mildly surprised, but didn't question it further, especially when his phone suddenly shut off and refused to turn back on. It wasn't hard to do, and Deku enjoyed messing with people from time to time. There was no direct interaction between heroes and students until after the written exam, which Deku was pretty sure he passed. The test was difficult, but with a stealthy quirk like his own, it helped him out on a couple difficult questions. He just had to be careful that none of the heroes noticed him freeze up while he entered cyberspace. It was only when he was walking out of the school's grounds that he was stopped by none other than Eraserhead himself, a forceful grip on his shoulder preventing him from leaving. We would like to have a couple words with you regarding the practical exam this morning. I've got things to do, he said coldly, shrugging the hand off his shoulder. I don't really have the time to sit and chat about how flimsy your encryption is. It's more than you know, Shigaraki. We would just need a few minutes to speak with you. I'm sorry, Deku said shortly, but I completed the practical as I would have done had it been an actual villain fight. Your skills seem on par with another hacker that we've seen. Tell me, have you ever heard of Deku? Those red eyes were frightening, seemingly piercing into his soul. Izumura shrugged, attempting to not appear bothered. I'm assuming you think that's me, so it wouldn't even matter if I said no. I don't know who you're talking about. Now, if you'll please excuse me, I have stuff to do. Without even taking a split second to debate his undoubtedly bad decision, he spun around and strode towards the gate. Maybe the heroes had something they could offer him, much greater than a student position at a top hero school. Maybe, despite his age, they saw the potential that All for One did. Maybe, perhaps, they wanted him. Well, he had made his choice years ago. They were only the latest ones to finally get it. He had zero interest in being a hero, he told himself firmly. It wouldn't happen. Even so, that small spark of hope that lingered in his chest for the longest time developed a tiny flame. His acceptance letter arrived in his mailbox only a week later. It didn't surprise him that he was accepted, but some small part of him felt disappointed. Now, he would have to reveal it to the League where he would be during the day. If they contacted him during the day, he would be discovered and probably arrested, most likely before he could get a message to Kurogiri and tell him what was going on. As long as he had access to some device, he could get that message to him. Kurogiri was a Namu as well, and that armor on his neck was also connected to All for One, and thus to him. He discovered that little piece of information accidentally, temporarily gaining complete control of his mind. All for One told him not to do it again, and Deku didn't, too shaky from the first attempt when he realized that he couldn't pull himself away. If he really needed to though, he could get a message through Kurogiri, at the cost of leaving his body alone with the heroes. If he was lucky, they might think he had gone into shock or something, and leave him in a hospital where he could easily escape once he returned. Unfortunately, Eraserhead knew his quirk, and he knew the signs. If he was with them, his medical emergency might be ignored. Kurogiri would risk capture if they came to get him. It was a little ironic, he thought, that the chief of security for the League was also the one getting into the most trouble. But hey, he needed to know what they were capable of, or at least that was his excuse. Either way, it would do him no good worrying about a situation that might happen, rather than one that will. He had to focus on the matter at hand, which was informing the League about what exactly he had been up to the past couple of weeks. Tomura would approve, right? He wouldn't rage out and kill him immediately for associating with heroes. Well, not like he had much of a choice about telling them, anyway. If he died here, it wasn't like he'd have many regrets. He took in a deep breath as he pushed open the door to Tomura's room. He could inform Kurogiri after he worried about the immediate threat. As expected, Tomura sat, feet crossed, on the end of his bed, gaming controller in his hands, staring at the TV opposite him. While Deku didn't exactly recognize what was on the screen, he did know enough to realize that Tomura would kill him if he shut it off. "What is it?" he grumbled, clicking one of the buttons to hit one of the creatures with a chainsaw. "I'm busy." "Aren't you?" "Always?" "Oh, it's you." "It's me," he confirmed. "What are you playing?" "Doom Eternal. Wickedly difficult if you don't know what you're doing." His character jumped, narrowly avoiding a fireball thrown in his direction. Deku raised an eyebrow. "Wicked, huh?" He still didn't look away from the screen, using his gun to bash in the head of some kind of zombie. "You don't get to make fun of my language. Now what do you want? You're distracting me. We can do this later." He brought a hand up to scratch at his neck. "Well, I didn't think that telling you later when I'm more likely to get myself killed would be a good idea. So no, this can't wait until later." There was a pause. "I'm listening." Deku let out a heavy sigh. "Can you pause that or something? I'm seriously considering frying your console at this point. You do that and you can kiss your precious life goodbye." "I wouldn't exactly call it precious, but sure." Tomura finally glanced his direction, not pausing the game but instead ducking his character behind the cover of some rocks. "Sit down or something. You're weirding me out just standing there like that." He made the decision to keep standing. "No thanks," he said stiffly. "Rather not be closer to you, thanks." "Yeah, you too, Deku," he returned, turning back to his game. The insult held little malice. "I assumed you would have little issue with me spying on the heroes." The clicking of the controller ceased, and a pause message popped up. Tomura finally turned to face him. "I thought that was what you were already doing." His voice was low and threatening. Deku tried his hardest to not step back. "Some things can't be said over the internet, Tomura," he reminded. "In fact, Now that they are aware of a hacker, Yua will try to keep a lot of their important data in person. I figured I would scope the place out myself. Oh. He tilted his head, almost disappointed, and shook the shaggy blue hair out of his eyes. Is that all? Almost thought you were going to say you'd betrayed us or something. I applied to Yua. The controller dropped onto the covers. Deku was half surprised that he didn't immediately disintegrate it. You did what now? There was only one conceivable way in, and I took it. I don't see why you're so surprised that was the way I went with. He shrugged, shoving his hands into his hoodie pockets to hide the slight tremble. I get to know what they teach the hero wannabes, and I also get a chance to get into their systems. I just figured you would need to know where I was before one of you blew my cover and called me or something in the middle of class. That sat in silence for a few minutes, Deku becoming increasingly more anxious the more Tamura thought it over, fingertips pressed together and staring at the controller. If Deku's answer was deemed unsatisfactory, then it was all over. You report everything to me. All for one cannot know anything about this. Deku jolted back, surprised. You won't tell him? You're not mad. Oh, I'm pissed, he corrected. You could have told me your plans beforehand when there was a better chance of me not killing you. He picked up the controller with 2 fingers, mulling something over. You're doing this to get more information. That's valuable intel. Deku, I'm not so ignorant that I don't know you have other clients. You have more than the League enticing you to do this. You will need the information, with All Might joining as a teacher, Izumura supplied. You want my help taking him down? Fine. I need to get inside his head, and this is the easiest way to do it. Tamura waved him off. Fine, yeah, whatever. As long as he dies, I don't care what you do. Not a word to All for one. He won't approve of you sticking your neck out there. He can't keep me cooped up in here forever. I'm still young, have a whole life of messing with people ahead of me. He shrugged, the tension lining his shoulders relaxing. How do you play that? Pretty simple. Want me to teach you? Deku contemplated the offer. What's in it for you? Jesus Christ, just take the controller, Izu. It would do me a lot of good to not have everyone around me be technologically 50 years behind me. Video games are the backbone of society. Not playing them is a cardinal sin. Yeah, Izumura grumbled. Stop with your Bible BS and I'll play with you. He sat on the edge of the bed, attempting to get somewhat comfortable as Tamura messed with the controller in his hands. I'm putting you on the tutorial first, he said, depositing the controller in Izumura's lap. You'd die immediately on the level I was on. Gee, thanks. Left trigger to fire the gun, Tamura said, ignoring the sarcasm. A to jump, and the joysticks move you around. If you get close to the zombies and they're glowing blue, press the right joystick. You can glory kill them and get your health back. Don't die, or I'll have to kill you. The glint in his eye gave him a slightly unhinged look. Maybe he wasn't actually kidding. As Tamura taught him to play, and Deku shot his way through the hordes of zombies, soldiers and imps, a thought struck him. Was this what having siblings was like? The days leading up to his first day ticked by with unbearable slowness. Maybe it was due to his scouting and frantic messaging with the principal, or maybe it was because he was much more on edge than normal, worried if All for One would realize what he had been up to. Tamura never said a word, nor did Kurogiri, but the acquisition of a few new, powerful members of their little group worried him. With Nezu's permission, he had been granted the ability to attend lessons virtually, without a camera. In order to make the principal trust him, he had to reveal more information than he was comfortable with, telling him that those he lived with had no information about his attendance at UA, and his current standing did not allow for him to properly engage in hero classes. As it was, his quirk was best suited for working behind the scenes, and in-person training would not be as valuable as communication with his fellow heroes, monitoring their positions and warning them of any issues. As far as Nezu believed, his voice was permanently warped by his quirk, sometimes dropping or shifting up an octave, with a computerized undertone and a permanent glitch that would make actively speaking difficult. As there was no other footage found of him speaking any other way, the principal was forced to accept it as truth and agreed to make class accommodations for him. His teacher, Aizawa, did not seem as pleased with the arrangement, but instead seemed interested in his quirk and his abilities. Having already had a close call with Eraserhead, Deku knew that he needed to keep the hero at arm's length. Carefully setting up his bedroom office, he carefully slipped his headset over his head, adjusting his mic to distort his voice enough to match what he told Nezu to expect. All three of his monitors glowed with a soft green light, his room dark just as he liked it. Running a hand through his dark hair, unbrushed and messy, he worked his way through detangling it as a way to calm the butterflies in his stomach. This first impression would be everything to him and the heroes, and whether they deemed him a threat or not. His quirk was used to pull up camera footage from the hallway as well as the other cameras in the class, only needing to monitor the direct area. His location could not be traced, yet he pulled up the feed from the cameras he placed around the base to watch for potential intruders. One could never be too careful. His procrastination done with, and all his necessary tools available to him, Deku logged into his classroom. One of his monitors cut to a feed of the room, the students mingling in groups by the desks. The teacher had clearly not arrived yet, but the board at the front must have shown his icon as having logged in. "Greetings," one of the students turned to the board, looking directly at the discrete camera that was placed there. "I was told we would have an online classmate. My name is..." "Tenya Ida," Deku smoothly replied. "Sibling of Tensei Ida, Pro Hero Ingenium. I know who you are." Ida appeared surprised, but quickly composed himself. "You've clearly done your hero research. I commend you." But Deku's attention had fallen to someone else in the room, sitting at one of the desks, glaring at the other students. Kachan. And the others, he scanned over the class. Most seemed average, little or no ties to real heroes. There was one, a blonde-haired boy with a black lightning streak through his hair, that might have been related to a pro, but he would have to look into it further, which was something he didn't want to do during this first class. "Momo Yayurazu," Deku said suddenly. "You have quite a few pro heroes in your family, don't you?" "Oh," she said nervously. "Why, yes, I do." "Recommendation as well. Impressive. I've heard those tests are quite difficult, but I've never looked into them. But I should have expected you to get in. I've followed your family quite a bit. And then, of course, I'm not surprised to see Shoto Todoroki in class." Indeed, the young son of Endeavor was separated from the others, eyes downcast and avoiding his classmates. "Why not?" he replied quietly. "Expected to see the top heroes' kids in this class." "I expected to see some students with talent." "Yes," Deku responded. "I see I was not disappointed." "And what do we call you?" Todoroki continued, his voice still soft. "Your icon doesn't give us much information. How are we to trust you?" His eyes focused on the camera, and Deku muted himself for a moment to collect his thoughts. This one was smart. "My name is Izumura Shigaraki," he said shortly. "My quirk is not useful in person. I work best from behind the scenes. That is all you need to know." A small smile appeared on his face. "That doesn't seem very trustworthy, Shigaraki." "It may not, but it is the truth." He paused, quickly checking one of the security cameras just down the hall, making a mental note of checking the building's schematics and figuring out where exactly the other cameras were located. "And I will warn you that your teacher is making his way down the hall. I would get to my seat. He's known to be quite strict." With that, he muted himself, deciding to pull out his notepad to take physical notes for himself to reference later. Todoroki would be more of a problem than anticipated. If Deku ever went public and the new hero students were informed of his activities, the others would be little issue, as his first impression of them did not pique his interest. Kachan was also smarter than he let on, and he could potentially be an issue as well. He leaned back in his chair, sighing. Damn those two. True to his word, Aizawa arrived only moments later, wrapped in a yellow sleeping bag that he then deposited behind the podium at the front of the room. Initially, he didn't give much notice to Deku, ignoring him in favor of disciplining the class. He listened in silence, almost smiling at his clear passion in making these kids into proper, well-tuned heroes. Eraserhead was a pain, but he was an excellent teacher. His students might actually turn out to be true heroes. Maybe Stain should be informed of this. He was musing over that thought when his teacher's attention turned to him. Shigaraki, I will be taking the class outside to run some tests on their physical capabilities. Had you not gotten special permission from the principal, I would have expelled you out of my class immediately. Good to know my impression has been good enough, Deku snarked. It's good to finally meet you, sensei. Polite language will get you nowhere. I hope that you will be able to properly engage with our lesson plan. I will not be directly catering to you, and Nezu has assured me that you will be able to keep up. I'll be watching, he promised. During training exercises, I ask that you supply my classmates with earpieces, as they would have in the field. I can speak with multiple people at once, as my quirk allows. True, he could watch from cameras, but this seemed to be interesting. It definitely would take the rest of the day. He certainly had the time to get over to Ua, provided that Kirigiri trusted him enough, and he could get his gear on before they discovered him absent from their discussion. Quickly muting himself, he set his headset on the desk, replacing it with a small earpiece and mic that was used in theater production, one that he had modified to suit his quirk's needs. His suit was custom, based on his very first hero costume design, with some slight modifications to allow for his hacker lifestyle. It wasn't very cold out, so he pointedly ignored the hoodie that had been made to sit on top of the suit if the chill got to be too much. His laptop was quickly grabbed, just in case, even though all he really needed was his phone to get into any system. However, if it ever got to the point where he couldn't rely on his quirk, he needed something easy to work with. The utility belt was clipped around his waist, a special case built into the back where he could store his laptop, small pockets available for cords and flash drives, which were loaded with data about pro heroes should he ever need it. After all, he knew a lot, but there were far too many heroes in Japan alone for him to memorize, let alone others from across the world. If he could get that information to his laptop, he could then use his quirk to access what he needed to in the blink of an eye. Unfortunately, when browsing the internet with his quirk, he couldn't access it as quickly as he could his own information, which was painstakingly organized due to his own mental pathways and the conclusions that he knew he'd draw. Things online were not always tagged with the information he needed, yet he had tagged a few useful places in cyberspace to help him find things faster. Even though time worked differently in his little computer world, it still left his body vulnerable for potentially hours at a time while he was working on his research. The rest of the costume was made mostly for mobility, a few self-defense things built into the gloves to enhance his chances of getting away in a fistfight. Tasers, small electric charges in the metal studs on his knuckles, activated with a push of a button, would stun the person he was fighting long enough for him to run. His mask was a simple rabbit mask covering his entire face, the ears hiding sensors to detect motion nearby, bonded there by a quirk he didn't quite understand, a hood over his head to hide his hair and the earpiece. A small heads-up display let him keep certain files in front of his eyes, the sensors giving him their readings as he moved around. He paid a fortune for it, but it was worth it in every way. Leaving the base was simple as usual, simply walking past Kirigiri and the shut door to Tamira's room. He armed the alarms, set to alert him to anyone entering or leaving the place, before returning inside. Can you transport me to just outside Ua? There's an outside class that I need to observe in person. The cameras aren't as extensive there, so I'll need to plant some more while I'm out. His mask didn't have a voice changer, but Deku didn't need one. Only Izumura needed a way to conceal his voice during school hours. In his belt, he had a few other items that might help him, each simulating very useful quirks so that he could work on his own the majority of the time, without relying on any of the villains to support him. With any luck, people would assume him to be a hero at first glance, and he could work undetected until a real hero showed up to stop him. He did also have some small, portable cameras that he could hide if need be, but they weren't meant for long-term exposure. Report your findings to Shigaraki after you return, Kirigiri reminded him. Deku waved him off. I'm just looking into the hero students a bit. Nothing he needs to know about. I just need to understand how much of a threat they'd be. Can you open a warp gate? Kirigiri nodded. Good luck on your mission, Izumura. The gate was opened, and Deku gripped his phone tightly in a gloved hand. Thanks. I'll call you in a few hours. He appeared just outside the wall of Ua. Walking through the gate or climbing over the wall would be easy enough, but he assumed that they might be within his visibility, as he was nearby the AuthorRei, their indoor training facility. On the wall, he could stay mostly hidden and vanish into the forest outside if he was spotted. It took far too long for him to find their location close enough to the wall for him to watch, zooming in using his heads-up display to watch them from the top of the wall. His earpiece fed audio right into his ears, allowing him to properly take in the situation. The tests were basic, definitely just a baseline for Aizawa to get to know their quirks, but Deku was learning all the same. Most had useful abilities, if trained correctly and honed to the level they needed to be for hero work. He was so absorbed in watching the students that he didn't notice the small figure approaching him, his sensors sending warnings into his vision. I didn't expect someone spying already on our first day. Deku jumped, hand immediately going behind his back, where he had stashed a small knife behind his laptop. Sure enough, Nezu, the principal himself, was watching him carefully, tail swishing from side to side. If only he could get his knife without being noticed. I don't suppose you'd tell me your name. It's only polite, you know. Somehow, the tone of voice made him want to respond. Maybe it was his manners, unexpected after so long with villains, or maybe it was something about his small stature that made Deku more inclined to speak. He raised his head to the side. They call me Deku. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through What If Hacker Deku Joined League of Villains. I hope you found it as intriguing and thought-provoking as we did. A big shout out to AuthorRei for crafting such a compelling story. Don't forget to check out their profile or archive of our own for more amazing works. The link is in the description below. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to What If Deku 2.0 for more fascinating explorations into the world of fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we're always excited to hear your thoughts and suggestions in the comments section. See you guys in the next video.